Hey guys, Aaron here. Today I'm making a quick little video showing you guys how to service the 10R80 transmission that's found in Ford and Lincoln cars, trucks, and SUVs. Now Ford came out with a 10-speed in 2017. They threw it behind the 2.7 and 3.5 liter EcoBoost engines, the 3-liter PowerStroke, and the 5-liter V8. Lincoln Navigators share the same transmission as well, along with the Mustangs, the Rangers, Transit vans, and Expeditions. Now overall, how to replace the filter and take out the fluid is going to be pretty much the same for all applications. However, if you have the 5-liter V8, you're going to have to lift up the transmission a couple inches to get the pan off, but we'll be going over that in a little bit. One other thing to note is that Ford actually used this auxiliary cooler 2017 through 2020. We have a few 2021s in our fleet and they don't have this cooler anymore, which is a nice thing. So depending on your application, you may have to remove this sway bar and kind of swing it out of the way in order to drop this cooler low enough. Also, depending on what motor you have, you're gonna have different heat shields depending on the exhaust and how close the exhaust is to the transmission pan itself. So now that we've gone over all the variations of the 10-speed, let's go ahead and go over the parts and tools we're going to need to get the job done. Now, as far as tools go, we'll need an 8mm socket, a 10 and a 13mm socket. We'll need a 10mm open end wrench, a 13 and a 19mm open end wrench. If you have the 5-liter, you're going to need a 15mm socket. If it's ratcheting, it also helps as well. And we'll need a 15mm socket to loosen up some of the bolts on the transmission mount, and of course a 3/8 ratchet as well. Now when it comes to filling the transmission, having something like this is super handy. This tool right here is a pneumatic dispenser and extractor. So when it comes to servicing these types of transmissions without a drain bolt, it's really nice to be able to extract some of the fluid, which we'll go over a little bit before you drop the pan. And also because the 10-speed doesn't have a dipstick tube, we're going to have to be filling the transmission from underneath the vehicle, which having something like this also helps with as well. You can use a hand pump. They're a lot cheaper and they're a lot easier to get. I'll provide a link in the description for both this tool and a hand pump, so when you're ready to service your transmission, you have it. So as far as our parts go, we're of course going to need a transmission filter by Motocraft. We're going to need the seal that seals the inlet of the filter itself. And we're going to need a couple seals for the oil cooler lines as well. After time, they can get brittle and they could actually stop sealing and cause a leak. We're also going to need about 6 quarts of Mercon ULV transmission fluid. It's the new transmission fluid by Ford, ultra low viscosity. That is a must with these transmissions. And as far as the oil pan gasket itself, from the factory, they are reusable, but a good rule of thumb that I go by, since I do a lot of services, is any vehicle that is over 150,000 miles, I'll go ahead and throw a new pan gasket on. The pan gasket itself is only about $30. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is disconnect the negative post of the battery. Since we're going to be taking the transmission pan off, we definitely don't want this thing to accidentally start up, since these vehicles can be remotely started. All right, so the first thing that we need to do is drop the front sway bar here. What we're going to be doing is using a 15mm socket. We're going to take down both nuts on this side. Then we're going to move over to the passenger side, do the same, slowly lift it down. That's going to allow us to get our cooler fully out of the way so we can remove our pan. Now, since this transmission has no drain bolt, we need to remove the pan to get the fluid out. So before we start disconnecting any cooler lines, what I like to do is I like to siphon out as much fluid as I can through the fill hole right here. That's actually the dipstick we're looking at. Take a 19mm, loosen that up, and with my little siphoning tool, I like to siphon out as much fluid as I can before I take the pan out. If you don't have a siphoning pump like I do, it's no big deal. Just makes the job a little bit messier. All right, so the cooler is mounted to the transmission bell housing in a couple different places. Let's remove these two front bolts with a 10mm socket. All right, next on the passenger side, let's go ahead and remove that single nut that attaches the line to the bell housing. Next, we're gonna follow the line to the oil pan itself. We're just gonna reach around and we're gonna pull the little plastic grommet out of the oil pan, which will allow the oil cooler line to swing down a little bit further. All right, next, let's go ahead and remove the 8mm bolt that is attaching the cooler line to the block. All right, so from here, we're able to remove the single 10mm bolt that holds the lines into the transmissions. We're gonna wiggle the lines and pull out at the same time. Be prepared for a little fluid to come out of the transmission. All right, so from here, let's go ahead and swing down our cooler assembly and our hoses. And we're just gonna bend them out of the way. All right, so from here, let's go ahead and remove the two heat shields that attach to the side of the oil pan. There's a total of 6 bolts that hold these two heat shields on. And the 5-liter V8, you're gonna have a little tough time removing them, but you can remove them. It's just that your exhaust is really close to your transmission pan in the rear right there. All right, so finally, after all that work, we're able to go ahead and start removing our transmission bolts. 13mm and a 10mm is what we're gonna need. However, if you have the 5-liter V8, you're not quite done yet. You're gonna need to remove this single bolt that holds the exhaust to the transmission mount. Then you're gonna proceed to use a 15mm socket and take off all 4 bolts that hold the mount to the transmission itself. 2 on the driver's side, 2 on the passenger side. And from there, you could either take the tail shaft of the transmission, or you can take the transfer case, because this is a 4-wheel drive, and you're gonna take a jack or a lift of some sort and lift up the transfer case, which will allow the transmission to separate from the exhaust, just because that exhaust is so close in the 5-liter. But since we have the 3.5 here, we won't be needing to do that. All right, so now we're ready to go ahead and remove all the hardware. What I like to do is remove the back bolts first and then work my way forward. That'll allow the fluid to escape from the rear. There's a slight taper to these pans, so it's definitely a lot easier if you allow the rear to drop first, and of course have a bucket underneath or a drain pan of some sort to catch all the fluid. Okay, so I got all the 8mm off the pan. It's time to move on to the 13s. What I like to do is take a Sharpie and just mark where the studs or the holes go for our studs for our exhaust. It's gonna make installation a lot easier and a lot quicker. All right, so now here we have our funky little filter. There's 2 bolts that hold our filter in. Once we have those out, we're gonna pull down and we're gonna remove the seal from the inlet right here. Keep note that the bolts are different lengths, so you have to remember which bolt goes where. Okay, so here we have our brand new seal. Let's go ahead and throw it in. Pretty easy. Now let's take our new filter and pop it into place and bolt it down. All right, so with our filter and everything bolted down, it's almost time to go ahead and throw our pan on. But before we do, let's just clean up the mating surface of the transmission pan and gasket. Just clean it of any debris or old oil. All right, now let's go ahead and start adding our bolts in. Just remember where your marks are for your studs, for your heat shield. I like to get the bolts just finger tight. That way we can manipulate the pan and have to, if we have to move it around a little bit to accommodate other bolts, we can. All right, so we got our pan on and our bolts torqued down. Let's go ahead and throw our heat shields on. If you have the 5-liter, keep the transmission up in the air and away from the exhaust when you're putting your heat shields on. It'll give you a little more room. Okay, so next we need to go ahead and replace the seals on the cooler lines. The back pieces stayed on the lines, and I'm gonna have to pry out the seals that stayed in the transmission. I'm gonna be using a small pick to do that. If you have a flathead screwdriver, something small, that will work too. All right, so now it's time to go ahead and add fluid into the transmission. We're gonna be doing about 5.5 quarts just as an initial fill. The manual states that we need to get the transmission up to operating temperature in excess of 200 degrees and then check the level on your dipstick. I'm not gonna be doing that. I don't do that just because with this particular motor, the catalytic converter is about 3 inches away from the dipstick itself, and it's very hard and long. It takes a long drive to get the transmission temperature up to 200 degrees. So what I do is I will actually just go just below, like a bar below where Ford recommends we put the level. And on this dipstick here, I have an A and a B indicator right here. Ford wants us to put the transmission fluid right in the middle of the B. However, with the vehicle not up to operating temperature, we want it to read a little bit lower than the B, because as we know, as fluid gets hot and it expands. So with the manual saying that they want it directly in the middle of the B at 200 degrees, I know I can actually put it just below B, just where the line starts. And that is a good way to go ahead and get this thing fully serviced and done without driving it for 10, 15, 20 minutes, getting the vehicle, the transmission fluid up to 200 degrees, which in some places it's very hard to do, especially if you live in a cold climate. And so then once we have the fluid in about 5.5 quarts, we're gonna put the dipstick back, start the vehicle, let it idle for a couple minutes. Then we're gonna go and we're gonna put the transmission into every gear, about 30 seconds. This is gonna fill all the passages and work out all the air. Then we're gonna leave it running in park, and we're gonna take our dipstick off and we're gonna read right where the level is at, and then we're gonna adjust accordingly from there. So with the transmission fluid level exactly where we want it, that pretty much concludes this video. I hope you guys learned something. Make sure to check out the links in the description for the parts and tools I used during this job. Thanks again as always, guys. See you next time.